So I'm so glad, I mean, you made the comment, Susan, that we're in this equity moment, this equity turn, but we actually really need to have some really good ideas about how to get it done. And the work that I'm looking at right now around gentrification, displacement, and planning policies to mitigate the harms for low-income people, renters, and communities of color in Portland is about just this issue. How do we move from setting a goal to actually embedding implementation into the everyday work of planners in terms of policies and practices? I think that when I look at some of the retrospective work that Norm has done on Cleveland, it seems to me that planners were sort of building up the work, really committed to the work, and then had a goal that encapsulated what is it that we're talking about. Okay, we can write this down in a short phrase. We're trying to expand choices for those who have the fewest choices, and then start to apply that, move that, push that out into the world, being strategic, being opportunistic in the way that they were able to move specific policies forward or programs forward. And in Portland, over the past 4 or 5 years, we have what in some ways seemed like a wonderful shortcut to that process. There was a planning process for a general plan, not our comprehensive land use plan, but a general plan in which equity was declared to be the goal, the thing. The mayor, the city council for the city of Portland declared equity to be the new way of doing business. The county jumped in, metro or regional government jumped in, so everyone was saying the same words. Everyone was celebrating equity. Everyone joined this regional governing for racial equity network, hosted the conference, felt really good about ourselves, and it seemed like a shortcut. Everybody's doing equity all the time, all at once, for all the things. And that turned out to be a lot more difficult than it seemed. So what I'm exploring in my paper is how we can move from that kind of wonderful fanfare to the really, what turns out to be, I believe, deep institutional change work that has to happen in order to really take this work forward. And I think that the issue of gentrification and more broadly displacement, housing displacement, is a great sort of focal case to think about that. It is probably the hottest issue in Portland right now because Portland has a lot of population growth in the central city. It's the beacon of livability and hipsterism and cool place to come. And you know, that's becoming an issue now beyond just the sort of traditionally underserved and underrepresented communities, but lots of folks are feeling housing affordability pressure. So it's very big in the sort of media and popular conversation, but it's also really genuinely, deeply a critical issue for communities of color, lower income folks, and renters who for a period of about 15 years now have been experiencing very serious housing instability and a push away from the most central neighborhoods that are also the most sort of resourced in terms of basic infrastructures, parks, healthy access to food, transit, job centers, etc. And it's also an issue where, of course, we have some of our most basic and fundamental conflicts that we deal with in planning in terms of equity considerations versus very powerful interest in real estate and development, which in Oregon, despite our long history of planning, are actually very intense and they're quite powerful. So how do we kind of take what looked like a really promising movement and strategy and get out of just sort of equity washing everything and saying we're doing equity and really starting to deeply embed that. And so what I've been looking at is this coalition of community-based organizations who are working both in collaboration but sometimes also in conflict with arts planners. So before I say some things about the lessons that we've learned from that, I want to just share a couple of key pieces of information about our planning context that are important to know. So one is that Portland has a commission form of government. So that means that each of our city council members is a commissioner of a certain set of departments. The heads of those, we call them bureaus. The heads of those bureaus are political appointees. And so each elected official has sort of a little cadre of units that they are the head of, basically, right? So that, and for Portland right now, the Bureau of Planning's head is the mayor. And in our last mayoral election, they had a change. So they have experienced a fairly large political dynamic change in their top leadership. Our current mayor, about 6 weeks ago, there's so many exciting things happening in this case study right now. About 6 weeks ago, declared a housing state of emergency in response to growing political pressure to do something about the housing situation, and then very shortly thereafter announced that he would not be running for re-election because polls indicated he might not make it out of the spring runoffs. And he's now going to focus a lot of attention on the comprehensive plan, which makes planners a little bit nervous because he is their commissioner in charge of the bureau, and that's a little bit stressful. So that's on our political side, something which makes, I think, moving the equity work a little bit challenging because it is so deeply tied into the electoral politics of the city. Planning is, of course, always political, but here you have the actual elected official directly directing the department and with the ability to hire and fire at the top people who have no civil service protection. The other piece that is important to know about why it is taking so much work to embed anti-displacement measures into our planning is that the state of Oregon preempts localities from pursuing certain basic planning policies I think are basic around housing affordability, things like inclusionary zoning, rent control, which is so broadly defined that it turns out to limit a number of other kind of affordable housing policies, and we also have very, very weak tenant protections in our landlord-tenant law in Oregon. So there's some kind of baseline legal context that means that planners and community members are having to do a lot more work to figure out the practices to embed in the plan. So we had this big equity fanfare, and you know, in some ways, I think Portland's taking on board equity as the new movement is part of Portland's general desire to be, you know, a hot city that competes with other cities. We talk a lot about whether Portland's punching above its weight, but we're like the best city on climate action, we're the best city on biking, and now we're going to be the best city on equity. But as it turns out, to actually do that takes a lot more work. And so I would argue that we didn't really recognize that that was a deep institutional change process. The way that equity came forward in Portland happened actually through a very authentic collaboration between community advocates and planning staff. There was a technical advisory group formed as part of a general plan process, the Portland plan process, that began to really think deeply about disparities in Portland, which break down very strongly along racial and ethnic lines, despite the fact that we are a majority white city. And the technical advisory group on equity built up genuine capacity to look at ways to address disparities and disparity reduction, to develop a sort of civil rights oriented framework for analyzing policies, but also built up a tremendous amount of trust and relationship in this collaboration, and developed case studies and research and created a framework that they felt would create a platform for doing the work. But as the sort of fanfare and excitement about equity mounted, it became clear that the city was not going to pursue this kind of incremental, let's build up our knowledge approach, but wanted to kind of hit everything at one time. And so the Planning Bureau ended up outsourcing a lot of its equity work. So because the planning staff had not all been engaged with thinking through how do you collect the data, analyze, create new alternatives, reprioritize, use an equity lens in your budget, the Planning Bureau began to do things like hire consultants to come in and rework components of their policies, to liaise with community members, and to do a lot of the work by kind of asking external folks to do the thinking. And when it came to gentrification, the city and the Planning Bureau in particular knew that gentrification was the priority planning issue for communities of color and low-income folks, but they went about taking that on board by hiring a consultant, which was me, to create a sort of shared, to try to create a shared understanding of what it meant to address gentrification. And it's really hard to be an external person in another institution building shared understanding among a staff of one agency, and then certainly to try to disseminate that to all of the other relevant places in the city, the Housing Bureau, the Infrastructure, Transportation Bureaus, the Redevelopment Authority. To bring them together was well outside of my purview. And indeed, I actually worked with only 2 staff members at the Bureau of Planning. So the connection was really attenuated there in the Bureau. And even though people cared about it, inside the Bureau, there wasn't a tremendous amount of political will externally, and there wasn't really a movement happening from the community to pick up what they saw was a technical report, right? The technical report didn't have a set of recommendations that said this is how we should now prioritize this work, because that wasn't my job. I was explicitly asked to step back from that moment so that they could do that. And even though individual planners were trying to implement some anti-displacement measures in individual projects, that was actually creating more division in the community, where they saw, well, why is one community getting good work and we're not getting that same work being done? So as the Planning Bureau moved into the comprehensive land use planning process, there was a new moment for community advocates to try to sort of move the dial on this work, to embed a larger framework for the city to address gentrification and displacement. So this new coalition has formed called DPDX, Anti-Displacement Portland. It is across racial and ethnic communities, but also across many housing interests, the fair housing community, tenants' rights activists, community development corporations, and really covers the spread of the city. So on the positive sort of collaborative side, I mean, I think it's all positive, but for planners, they see a real dichotomy between the collaborative work that the coalition does and then the outside actions, activism, and movement work. For them, they view that as quite alarming and upsetting in some ways. The inside collaborative work has helped planners to reconcile one of their biggest political problems, which was a question of whether it was is it equitable to prioritize stabilizing low-income folks in gentrifying neighborhoods and not allocate resources to low-income people in low-income neighborhoods that aren't gentrifying? Because this coalition crosses all of those boundaries and focuses on the displacement question and policies that stabilize people in housing, it eliminated that kind of competition for resources for planners. And because the coalition is housed in our state land use advocacy organization, 1000 Friends of Oregon, they were able to bring some real legal expertise on Oregon land use law to help work together with planners to figure out how do we navigate around this strange legal context that we have that seems to prohibit every possible best practice that we could use in planning. And they've come up with some ways to embed things like social impact assessments and mitigation, community benefits agreements into the comprehensive plan, but also to lay the groundwork for the city to pursue policies like inclusionary zoning if the state law does change over the life of the comprehensive plan. And they're able to bring some confidence to planners with this legal expertise that's part of the coalition that this will work and this will be okay, they won't be challenged. But at the same time, the coalition has been working their outside game. They could see that the mayor and other elected officials were kind of reverting back to the typical response to the real estate industry, to homeowners, and to the kind of usual suspects of their political constituencies, more so than to the equity constituency. They were sort of like, hey, we said equity, we said lens, we're doing it. So they've been trying to build up a much more public movement and figuring out that targeting the Planning and Sustainability Commission was a space where there were lots of public meetings, hearings, and where they can celebrate their accomplishments. So their actions are all very positively framed. They bring cake, they bring horns and party hats and cheer when amendments are passed. But again, for the planners, this feels very atypical, and so there's a real tension going on in the Bureau about, we feel like we want to do equity, we care about equity, we've been working with you, and now are you calling us out? So trying to navigate bolstering the planners, building a social movement that says, yes, you're doing great, but we also want you to do better, in order so that the Planning Bureau doesn't shut the door on the collaboration with advocates, has been sort of a challenge to thread that needle. And Portland has a history of citizen planning and citizen activism in planning. We're the city that stopped a freeway, so this is nothing new. But I think around the issue of equity, particularly when race is part of the equation, it feels very different to the planners. It's not just an angry community group talking about parking in their neighborhood, but something that's about deep values. And so they are trying to reconcile how do they work in this sort of more activist space. So the result is trying to learn to productively mix collaboration and kind of light confrontation as a way to move actual implementation of equity, to embed this into individual projects, but also into implementation of larger things like mixed-use zoning. And I think this greater engagement with advocacy and planning together is helping to really figure out the work and to really now build the capacity that wasn't being done when we just said do equity, but really that a much broader set of planners are engaged in the conversation, and community advocates are learning much more systematically how the land use system works and can be used to further the aims of anti-displacement. And finally, that they're with this growing movement and collaboration and coalition building, that there will be a more sustained support so that equity doesn't become just another buzzword on our list of Portland phraseologies.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And that's great. I usually say to my students, are we awake? Good morning.
Good morning.
We're going to church. Okay. So before I start, I want to say, as Lisa Bates reminded me, so when I'm in New Orleans, we say who data. But when we come north, we say who data. Right? So that's the difference. So again, I'm Michelle Thomas. It's my colleague, Brittany Arsenault, former student, and as she said, she is not a graduate student, she's a GIS professional, so we'll get that one out of the way. Well, we're going to talk with you briefly about public participation geographic information systems, otherwise known as PPGIS, which is a model of citizen science to promote equitable community engagement. The overview of our presentation today will be, I'm going to provide a brief overview of our chapter and our goals, and that's what's going to frame our discussion. We're going to talk about citizen science in brief, but we spent a lot of time on what is citizen science and how does it relate to PPGIS, especially when in relation to empowerment and equity as we go forward. I know we're going to hear a lot about equity this morning, so I'll only say it a few more times. But one of the biggest issues in terms of being able to use PPGIS, is data accessibility and standards, and I'm speaking louder because I was told by Mrs. Clavell to speak louder. We have models of PPGIS that Brittany is going to talk with you about, and the three that we've selected to talk about today are community-led, community-focused, community-sustained, and talk about some of the challenges and the future of PPGIS, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes to answer some of your questions. So our chapter, again, is focusing on exploring these models of engagement and data standards because they've changed over time, and the definition of what is data. Because data is certainly, there's community data, municipal data, so there's a lot of questions about what is the data, how is it collected. But now as we go forward, there's a future of what is this community of practice, and the community of practice suggests that, yes, we want to look at grounded participation, but the models have changed. Citizen science is one type of model with PPGIS, but it changes in different neighborhoods, it changes with different communities, and it changes with different projects. So in order for us to be able to frame our work, we're focusing on neighborhood empowerment, place-based neighborhood level issues. So we're not going to be focusing on regional or federal projects. We also know that we need to customize the projects and it's relevant for a specific situation. So PPGIS is not cookie cutter. We can take some of the actions that we're going to talk about and use them in different neighborhoods, but they are not, they have to be customized for a particular neighborhood. So we're hoping that for our chapter, we're going to offer academics and practitioners and teach them both how to talk with each other and work with each other and work with the communities a bit better so that we can have an equitable and effective strategy for long-term and sustainable community engagement. And one of the issues that happens at the university is many of our projects are based upon the semester or based upon the year. And we know that that's not how, especially what Lisa was talking about, life doesn't happen that way in the community. So in terms of citizen science in general can be used in all different types of fields. But generally you train the community to gather data at the local level that's maintained by the participants. So it's the residents that in the community that will gather the information and maintain it and sustain it. So I usually say for PPGIS, it's the university, after we go in, we got to get out of the way. So citizen science is a model, and again, we've talked about it varies by policy initiatives, community values, and neighborhood goals. But the constant with PPGIS is you have the community, you have university, and municipality. Our examples will show you how we engage in different ways and on different levels. So we're going to focus our work in the community planning projects. And again, it could be transportation, it could be housing. The practice of citizen science is built upon a participatory model. But the level of participation and engagement really does vary because there are barriers. You've heard many of these. There's not enough data, there's not enough money. And of course, there's never enough time. But the willingness of citizens to manage those responsibilities and the ease of including people in the neighborhood will help make changes in the municipal policies and planning protocols. And that's what we're hoping for. But there also are inherent disparities. Obviously, technology, even though it's much better today, we were talking at the table that I still remember floppy disks. And now we're using USBs, we're so excited. But not everybody has a computer. Not everybody has the RAM. Not everybody has access. Everyone says you have a smartphone, you should be able to go out and collect data. Well, maybe not everybody has a smartphone or knows how to program. So we have to look at, and we're emphasizing more of the work that we're doing is, yes, let's focus on figuring out the technology issues. But PPGIS is shifting more in terms of trying to look like science, and it's focusing more on sound practices, measurable goals, instead of how to still have equitable participation. But there are benefits, and we will talk after Brittany, risks of using PPGIS, but we also have to think about ethics. Remember the book, How to Lie with Data? Some of us, you lie with it or not. But some of us, we try not to, we don't even know what we do. So we have to look at standards. So that's the future of PPGIS. But many of the issues that, again, relate to the creation and, many of the issues that we are focused on and trying to fix, not the technology, it's the data.
So PPGIS is a technological tool and it's inherently based on having data access. Oftentimes this data is developed and managed by municipalities or private companies and isn't always accessible to the public for integration. Recently we've begun to see more city agencies develop enterprise systems to display community records with GIS information. This is an example of the New Orleans City Property Viewer, where they're taking their public records and spatially representing them, but they're not providing them in a way that the community can download this in forms such as Excel and integrate it with their own community gathered data. I'm going to go through 3 different models regarding data integration. These cases will show how PPGIS practices allows communities to incorporate their data. The following models discussed were all implemented in New Orleans through a university neighborhood association partnership, In each model, the university provided the data standards and cartographic visualizations through maps, yet the level of community participation in each model varies. So the first model is a community-led model. This example was done in Treme. It's a historic neighborhood. Some of you may have seen the HBO show about it. But we worked with the neighborhood association, the historic Faubourg Treme Association. We as the university were brought in to support an existing blight reduction plan developed by the organization to provide standards and guidance for the neighborhood to catalog and visualize blight. We provided them tools to survey over 800 parcels within their neighborhood boundaries, but they as the community collected the data, they entered the data, and then they were able to validate the data because of their local knowledge. They used this information to compare the properties they identified as blighted with the City of New Orleans blight list to see inconsistencies and consistencies in the classifications. Although we worked with them to create these standards and help them develop a database and provided them maps, there's still limitations to this project. They can update this data into the future in an organized format based on the standards we provided, but the products we provided are temporarily limited because they're not going to be able to update the maps. They can just update the database because they don't have that GIS skill set. The next model is community focused. This example is based in the Lower Ninth Ward and Holy Cross neighborhoods. At the time of this project, in 2011, a very limited amount of residents had returned to the neighborhood. And we worked with 2 nonprofits embedded in the community to conduct outreach and identify the existing residents and coordinate them on what their priorities were. They also brought in volunteers that were coming to New Orleans at the time from out of the state to help with our recovery efforts. We also worked with the Regional Planning Commission, who acted as the municipal agent to support the project. And they provided us with materials to actually conduct and also provided us the plotting capabilities to give the cartographic aids back to the embedded organizations. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see a photo of a nicely mowed lot, but unfortunately, the majority of the lots in the Lower Ninth Ward represented in green on this map do not look like that. These are all locations where residents previously lived and now are vacant after Katrina. So this was really a tool to provide to the embedded organizations and to residents as they return to track and see what areas of the neighborhood were recovering and do different types of spatial analysis. The third model applies to communities that are present, educated, and dedicated to project sustainability. This project is located in the Uptown Triangle neighborhood. The City Council approached this neighborhood and asked them what their priorities for neighborhood improvement were, and they felt that there was an issue with broken streetlights. As you can see on the top of this map, the red dots that don't have the circle around them, those are all lights that are off and not functioning. So what they did is they identified their priorities and we provided them with standards to collect their data. And they went out and they collected the information and they also had the technical skills to create a map. So they went in and they looked at the type of street lights, they calculated the radius of light for everyone, and they did the actual analysis. So just like the Treme, they can continue to update their data set, but they can also expand the spatial analysis by overlaying things such as crime data if they wanted to go forward. They have the capacity to expand their empowerment tool set and build on the baseline analysis the university was able to provide.
So going forward, we have some challenges. The nature of PPGIS is changing and the definition is changing. Originally it was for community mapping, it was top-down. We tried to show you and give you examples that it is still and should be bottom-up. There are still going to be issues with data types and access. With open source technology and folks being able to download and upload information off their smartphones, there's still a lot of opportunity, but again, what's the data? And some of the issues about data standards, there's issues of integrity, validity, reliability, City of New Orleans does not allow any uploads of community data. So we're trying to figure out how to manage that issue so we can have that local knowledge. But the community of practice is changing. I was at the White House a few weeks ago, and there was a meeting that talked about federal community practice and setting standards and training from the federal level on down. So there may be some standards, but then again, how are they going to play out locally? So this new PPGIS, it is a model. It's not just a product. Many think it is. Citizen science is a science, and especially for those who are not in STEM, it is a science. And PPGIS is a tool and a way to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be back in Cleveland. 35 years ago, I was a neighborhood planner here in Cleveland, not too far from here, maybe about a mile from here. And the work we did was suffused with the principles of equity planning and norms influence. We viewed ourselves as gorillas in the bureaucracy, right? I would feed information to the community groups, the progressive community groups, say, hey, the city council is going to talk about this next week, you should think about, that sort of thing, and trying to steer resources from the downtown growth machine toward the neighborhood. So it was heady times back then. It's nice to be back in town, and also Dennis Keating gave me a tour of the West Side and all the exciting stuff that's happening in Cleveland. And as Susan mentioned, my first book, The Crisis of Growth Politics, you can still get it on Amazon.com. Just look it up there, and you can purchase it, a used copy, for 1 cent. But I'm not a cheap date, however, because it costs you $3.99 to get it shipped, so it's not that cheap. But anyway, it's good to be back. But times have changed. They really have changed, I guess, in 35 years. Huh? And what's happening, of course, is poverty is moving to the suburbs. And that's a very different physical, economic, and especially political institutional context to address these kinds of issues. So compared to Lisa, right, I'm talking about weak market areas for the most part, very different institutional context. So I'm going to talk about the growth of suburban poverty, the challenge that presents, and do a case study if I have time to talk about what we've been doing in St. Louis. So St. Louis, which is normally viewed as a very ordinary metropolitan area, usually right in the middle of the pack on everything, right? On the suburbanization of poverty, we are a cutting-edge metropolitan area. We lead the nation. We are 43rd out of the 50 top metros in the percentage of the population located in the central city, the percentage of the regional population, right? So it's only about 11% lives in the city, so we're very suburbanized. Our boundaries have been fixed since the Great Divorce of 1875, so we haven't grown. The city hasn't grown. We're also third out of 50 in both municipal fragmentation and school district fragmentation. So as we all know, if you read the literature, that the more you are fragmented municipally in terms of land use, the more you're fragmented in terms of schools, the more segregated you are both economically and racially. So that's fed a kind of racial and economic segregation in St. Louis. So I would argue that St. Louis reflects in many ways the future of poverty in the United States. That is, we are moving more toward the European pattern, right? Which is the well-to-do live toward the center, and the poor are pushed toward the periphery, and it's going to be a very different institutional environment, especially in the American context with that kind of pattern. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of these kinds of statistics, but in the Kneebone and Berube book, they point out that poverty grew by 53% in the suburbs between 2000 and 2010, and only grew by 23% in central cities. So it's clear where the trends are nationally, right? The poverty is increasing much more rapidly, and more people live in suburbs now than live in central cities. So we have a very different context that way. And it's also the growth of concentrated poverty. So just looking here at that, it's not just that poverty is moving to suburbs, it's increasingly becoming concentrated in certain quarters of the suburban area, certain parts of the suburban area. So we look at here's poverty, here's St. Louis. Like I say, we're really on the cutting edge. The red line is St. Louis County, which is located outside the city, where the city and the county are separate, right? The city is its own county, so you can see there that poverty has grown rapidly. The number of poor people has grown rapidly in St. Louis County, and it's about stable in the city. The city is doing better, believe it or not. We are, of course, the world's, I saw a book recently, we're the #1 shrinking city in the world, right? We have the greatest population loss from peak to trough of any central city in the world, but the city is actually doing better lately, but the suburbs, especially the northern suburbs, are having a lot of trouble. Here is poverty concentration in the city. This, by the way, is someplace you may have heard of called Ferguson. That is, and you can see that the eastern side of Ferguson gets to be a 30% plus poverty rate. I'm going to talk about an area of the Normandy School District, which borders on Ferguson right here, which is part of an initiative I want to talk about. But what you see is, if we could do this over time, I could do some slick GIS here. Michelle, you could probably do it for me, right? We go 70, 80, 90, you just see the red moving from the city right toward the suburbs, right? And so concentrated poverty is moving into those north suburbs of St. Louis. So the challenge in the suburbs, it's a double whammy. Poverty in the suburbs is a double whammy. Not only is it concentrated, and of course tremendous inequities, right? You have institutional weaknesses and institutional inequities that are very deep. And this is what we need to think about as equity planners. The definition of equity planning, which comes out of Pierre and Norm's book many years ago, right? I'm going to quote, equity planning refers to persons working in official capacities for city governments. That's how you define equity planners. They work for city governments, they try to make equity happen, right? And the goal of equity planners is to steer the resources of city governments away from the downtown growth machine, away from toward neighborhoods, toward grassroots organizations working in low-income and minority communities. And as I said, that suffused the work we did in Cleveland back then. We were working in city government, and there was a movement out there in the neighborhoods. There was neighborhood organizing going on intensively in the 70s and 80s in Cleveland. There were CDCs being formed. We were trying to feed the resources of the city toward these civic organizations. In the suburban context, both of those factors are much different. There isn't a strong city government with a lot of resources to steer, right, in the first place. And secondly, civil society is stunted, relatively speaking, compared to what we see in a city like in Cleveland and also in St. Louis, by the way. For example, in St. Louis, Susan mentioned it with a network of CDCs. We have 24 members in the city of St. Louis and only 3 that operate in the county. So there are more people in the county, more poor people in the county, right? More need in the county, but we have very few because they don't have that history of the war on poverty, that history of community organizing that goes back, that laid the groundwork for a lot of this work back in the 70s and 80s. So inner-ring suburban governments also lack the resources, as I said, to distribute to disadvantaged parts of the community. If you do a thought experiment for a moment, take the urban ghettos of the 60s and 70s and draw a line around them and make them their own little city, right? Then how would they engage in equity planning, right? They wouldn't have anything to draw upon, right? You'd encircle the poverty in an institutional context, and that's essentially what's happening in suburbs, is we are drawing institutional boundaries around very poor communities or neighborhoods. With the exception of schools, suburbs are low public spending, right? The suburban lifestyle is a privatized lifestyle. It's not based upon fulsome city services, right, and an active public sector. It's withdrawal in part from the public sector, with the big exception of schools, as I said. Suburbs were designed for a private lifestyle. So if you have homes with large lots, nice swimming pools and basketball courts, you don't need public parks, public pools, and rec centers, right? You have that in the suburbs. So in many of the suburbs of St. Louis, you might ask, of the affluent suburb in St. Louis, well, the governments are pretty weak. They could care less, right? They've got their country clubs. There's a minimum level of services, right, that are needed, but they're not looking for the kind of strong public sector that, frankly, low-income communities need. They need the power of the public sector. They need to be able to plan. They need to be able to adjust to changing economic challenges. So the suburban lifestyle, I would argue, in some ways, is very attractive to low-income families who have moved from the central cities seeking a better life, seeking more greenery, better schools, all these sorts of things. But in many ways, the suburban lifestyle is a hoax for the poor because it's actually more expensive in terms of energy. It's more expensive in terms of transportation. You don't have the strong institutions to back you up. And therefore, while it's attractive, many low-income households end up in situations, I would argue, that are more deprived in some sense than the central cities. So you also have, you have generally weak and smaller public sector in the suburbs, but you also have a fiscal crisis in the suburbs. This is per capita assessed valuation across the suburbs of St. Louis County. I probably should have said, here's the city of St. Louis, the Mississippi River. This is the border of the city. This is the suburban parts of St. Louis County. As you can see, it maps very closely to the previous map I had about poverty, right? But you can see the per capita income varies from as low as $1,519 of assessed cap value per capita all the way up to $187,000. I calculate that's a 12,300% difference from the top to the bottom. Talk about inequity across places and institutions, right, with very strong suburban governments with tremendous fiscal resources. We can get into the details here. Talk about sales taxes and other things, right? It gets complicated, but in the essence of it is there's huge differences across these areas. I'm going to talk about the 24-1 case here. 24-1 is one school district, which, as I said, is located right bordering on Ferguson, right, with 24 governments touching it, which is extraordinary, right? Talk about problems of collective action and fragmented institutional setting. The average size of a government within 24-1 is 1,800 persons per municipality. You can imagine the kind of capacity that a government with that kind of size has. So if we define equity planning norm as planners who work for city governments who are pursuing equity, we don't have a single equity planner in this geography, right? Because there are, I asked the person who has the 24 initiative, right? Are there any city planners? She said not a single full-time city planner works for any of these governments, okay? So we've got a problem right away, right? That there are, by definition, according to Pierre and Norm, there are no equity planners in this geography, right? So there's also a lack of neighborhood organizations, as I mentioned. There's no CDC. There is, however, one very powerful nonprofit, Beyond Housing, which is an extraordinary nonprofit in the St. Louis region. Has a staff of about 70. It's a NeighborWorks affiliate. It did all the foreclosure work in the region, right? And it also has a place-based initiative focused on 24-1. What makes this really unique is they've had an anonymous funder. And the anonymous funder has provided them with the wherewithal to do the kind of organizing they're doing. Otherwise, they couldn't do what they're doing in the 24-1 footprint. Here are some of their accomplishments. You know, it's basically one of the more impressive comprehensive community initiatives in the nation. They've done, for example, the first thing they said is the community said we need a grocery store. We don't have any grocery store nearby. They spent 7 years. I think there's 9 different subsidies involved in this thing. They own the grocery store. They made sure it was it's brick on the outside. It's real quality construction. There has been a bit of graffiti. It's one of the most profitable in the Save-A-Lot chain. So anyway, it's been a real success story in a very, once again, very low income suburban setting. They have individual development accounts for every child in the school system. IDAs, they have they've coordinated the daycare. They just opened a movie theater a few days ago, which is extraordinary in the area. So there's a multiplex movie theater in this area. We went to the White House at one point and told our story to the different departments in the White House. I think in part it was because they were seeing us as working in this kind of unique, you know, suburban setting, working across the silos and across. So it's a very impressive. But what I want to talk about in particular is using transit-oriented development. I only have a couple minutes to tell this story, but I'll try to do it as quick as I can just to get a few of the points out. We have a Metrolink system here, about 80 or 90 miles of light rail. It does go through Normandy. You can see where the arrow is. That's the Rock Road Station, which is located in the 24-1 footprint. The benefits of TOD in a weak market setting: you can reduce transportation costs for residents. Once again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but generally speaking, it costs between $6,000 and $8,000 to own a car in the United States. There's no way around it. You can buy a jalopy if you want to. Hope you get lucky. You don't have to fix it, but eventually you'll have to fix it, right? And so we're talking, if you can save $8,000, right, you got to earn 10 or 11 in order to get that 8,000, right? So that's a significant anti-poverty strategy. If you can get somebody to dispense with a car, I'm sure Joe has more detail about this, right? That you can see also if we can connect people to employment that they otherwise couldn't connect to conveniently, connect to other opportunities for quality of life, and really create a center in the community, right, where it provides some setting for the community. Very quickly, if you look at the issue of jobs, there are 46,000 jobs at the sort of mid-level jobs that the people, the residents of this area could qualify for. These are jobs that don't require a college degree, but probably require a little bit more than a high school degree, somewhere in there, right? So you can access them within a half-mile walk of a transit station in St. Louis County. So there'd be tremendous access to jobs if we could locate residents in this area. Here's what it looks like right now around the station. This is not exactly a high value area. You can see this is the transit station, big sea of the asphalt, which is the first thing the residents said in the civic engagement process is, can't we do something other than having a big civic. If you've ever been to St. Louis in the summer, you know what it's like walking across a parking lot like that. There's a big flea market, which is, FBI is after the owner of the flea market for selling, where that seemed to have helped apparently in the purchase of the land recently. They have purchased the land from him finally. And this road here, typical suburban, it's about seven lanes wide. You take your life in your hands walking across it. So it's not at all an attractive environment for doing this kind of work. It's going to be a real challenge to do TOD here. We did community engagement. Caveat emptor, I helped fund this, so I'm maybe a little biased, right, in the civic engagement, but through the DESLE. But essentially, we had 5 different ways to engage the citizens. You all, once again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. You can't just have meetings because some people are not articulate or not comfortable with meetings. So we hired people from the neighborhood to go door to door. We even installed there was an artist there who installed a wood burning system and had people put suggestions, and then she would burn them onto the installation. So there's a lot of different ways to engage people. And here's to make a long story short. So what we did is we presented a very broad plan for doing TOD around the station, right? I mean, very, very broad conceptual plan. I went to this. What do you think? What do you think the first reaction was of the citizens here in Pagedale, Missouri, in this suburban setting? What do you think their first reaction was? We said, what about TOD? Well, yes, they said, who'd want to live next to a transit station? Are you dumb? I mean, the majority position was, who'd want to live next to this noisy tract? You know, what's this about? They live in the suburbs. They don't live in New York, right? They're not used to this kind of thing. And second thing they said, if you're going to build housing here, and they were clear about this, we do not want high-rise housing. We don't want tall structures. That's the project. We want single-family homes on nice lots if you're going to build housing. Okay, well, needless to say, the planners were taken aback. They were like, whoa, this is not the reaction that we're expecting, but, this is what the citizens were telling us. And essentially, you had a learning process that went on. We presented, and I can't go into detail here, but we presented the data to the community. Well, listen, if we do single-family homes on a large lot, there's the kind of subsidy per unit we'll have to get. This is going to be almost impossible. But if we do townhouses with common walls, we can do it with much less subsidy. Not only that, but if we could get enough density in here, density is a 4-letter word, by the way, in St. Louis, we can create a pedestrian-friendly environment that will stimulate some local retail. We can maybe have a convenience store. We can have some stuff like this, right? And they got it. They got it right away. They understood this. They said, okay, we would ultimately like to have, and we did a survey following the civic engagement process and asked people, has your position changed? And they said yes. They became much more accepting of some form of moderate density, I would call it, housing in the area. And also, of course, the planners learned, the other needs of the community. They wanted a community center. It turned out what they really were looking at, and we said, well, there's other community centers in the area. And to make a long story short, they wanted a banquet center, someplace where you could have family events, right? Things like that. It didn't exist in the area. So anyway, there was a real learning process on the part of the planners. Also, they learned, what it is the community needs. The community changed its views, and as a result, we're hoping that this will become a reality, and it's going to be a phased-in, lower density kind of TOD, right? We hope. It's going to require a lot of subsidy. This is a weak market setting, not a strong market here. Homes sell for maybe $50,000 to $55,000, and we're going to have to somehow get the subsidies. Ultimately, we hope it'll be a center for the community. Just a few final points. Linking disadvantaged suburbs to regional job clusters through light rail could be an effective anti-poverty strategy, I think, if it could be achieved. Scaling this up will be very difficult because if you don't have the kind of high-capacity organization that Beyond Housing represented, this was years and years of civic engagement and lots of resources going into pulling this together, right? And most of the CDCs in St. Louis could not accomplish this, and there's none in the suburbs, none other in the suburbs that could accomplish this kind of deal. And finally, is this whole question of regional dynamics, the fact that we have sprawl and as Tom Byers pointed out, the fact that regions like St. Louis are overproducing housing every year, so we're constantly siphoning off housing demand from these older inner ring suburbs, and it's very difficult to rebuild the market when you have that kind of regional context. Thank you very much.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm number 4, right before the break, I hope. I was a little struck by Bob Gleason's question this morning, is there a School of Cleveland Planning? And it sort of made me think about when Norman called me and he told me about this book project that he wanted to work on. And it really sort of is the same question, I think. And I'm not sure that there's a School of Cleveland Planning, but I'm terribly convinced that there's a Center of Equity Collusion right here at Cleveland State University with Norm as our guru. I also go back, I guess, 35 years with Norm now. And it went back to the Cleveland Foundation India, who was giving money to Norm to set up his advocacy shop in exile at Cleveland State University. It goes back to Cornell, who Norm got everybody he knew to go to Cornell, at least for a semester, where I went one pleasant summer and learned how to sail. And it comes back to a lot of people in this room who I think, frankly, have been influenced by Norm Krumholtz in any number of ways. And I know our concept is equity planning, but over the years, I've come to think of what Norm has done as sort of affecting, infecting, sort of pushing, shoving. However, he's influenced equity policy thinking, equity planning, equity practice is what I think we're all about. And I think the earlier panels and what we're going to talk about the rest of the day really reflects that. So, when Norm asked me if I would write a chapter in the book, I was like, what do you want me to write a chapter on? I wasn't quite sort of thinking about the way that Norm was always ahead of us. And so after we talked about it a bit, I kind of reflected and was sort of persuaded that what we had done in our tenure in the administration of Sean Donovan, the first HUD secretary in the Obama administration, really did reflect equity, planning, and practice. And I hadn't really thought about it that way. And I think the theme of my chapter is you don't always have to be intentional. You don't always have to declare an equity agenda. But the very fact that a cohort, a generation, 35 years of practitioners have kind of come into government, have come into city planning departments, have come into major community development corporations, have worked at all levels, is infecting an equity practice. And I think that's, in reflection, I had to think about it a lot because most of the summer I had to work on Norm's chapter, helping him think through. And when I read his chapter, I was really impressed with the breadth, the scope, the span of what we're now all calling equity policy planning practice that I think Norm has been very much at the center of. So, with that in mind, step back. I'm not going to go into great detail about this rental assistance demonstration. I'm going to be a little more literal about my chapter and what I'm trying to do with the chapter. But I will take a minute to explain what it is. Susan did mention it. Sean Donovan came into government and he said public housing is a mess. It's been treated disequitably. It's completely a different system than any other kind of housing or affordable housing system. And we need to do something about it. And so he convened a team and set himself to really do something about that. And the net result of that is a demonstration up to now 185,000 units of public housing, which is about 15% of the inventory, can now essentially take its funding subsidies, its operating and capital subsidies that didn't work terribly well. We were losing 10,000 units of housing a year, hard units of public housing a year under this old system. Take those subsidies and convert them to more proven project-based Section 8 contracts that Mark and Enterprise and a lot of you other affordable housing developers in the room have used over the years to leverage private debt and equity investment to augment the limited public investment, create new private investment, and steward something called public housing for the future. So that's really what the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, is all about. It has actually been working fairly well. I mean, Sean was right. If we could get this thing going, it may take off. And in the 3 years since we got it authorized by the Congress, it was about November of 2012 that we got it approved. In the 3 years since, we've launched a program, HUD's launched a program, and toward that 185,000 of public housing units, it's now converted 20,000 units, so we have a little proof in the pudding to look at. And there's been over $1 billion, about $1.5 billion of new capital generated for public housing, as public housing, relying on the same amount of federal resources that we started with. So no new money has created $1.5 billion of new private investment for public housing just in the startup of the RAD program. So with that as a backdrop, sort of the central theme, the question that I'm at least trying to answer with this is, can you take this equity planning policy practice sort of lens and apply it to federal policy making? A lot of what we're talking about today is regional or local examples of equity practice. Great. Can that be done at the federal level? I think we could argue that the Obama administration, the Affordable Care Act, any number of examples say yes. This is an illustration, I hope, of what we can do in the housing and community development world. So the narrative arc that I'm trying to sort of work through here is that Secretary Donovan came into office. He didn't take out an equity planning playbook. He didn't get a list out. He just came in because of his experience, and the people that he recruited to work around him had similar kind of experiences shaped in city government or state government or CDCs or foundations. That team just kind of came in with a natural set of kind of equity practice instincts and went to work immediately. There wasn't a declaration of equity planning. There wasn't any big sort of planning process. There was the normal kind of give and take in a federal policy making process. And it wasn't an intentional design against the playbook as much as it was a number of practitioners came into office and just said, we have an opportunity right now with a 4-year time window to get something done. So most of what got done, I do think, in reflection, follows sort of that equity planning practice arc, if you will. And I'm kind of a strict constructionist kind of guy, so I went back and I read some of Norm's articles, and I looked for, you know, what are the main equity principles and lessons that Norm and his practice, and many of you in sort of reading some of what was going to go on in this book, had highlighted. So I, made a list. And here they are, creating more choices for those who have few, good analysis, shaping an equity agenda, basically anticipating and getting your arms around problems, seizing an initiative, creating a narrative, defining what you're trying to do. I think are very important, using outside expertise as possible. We've already talked about that this morning. One of the great lessons I got from Norm as a young guy was persistence. Persistence is going to be the driver of equity planning change, and I think that's something that we're seeing here. Also, the ability to negotiate. There's no perfect world. There's no perfect outcome, but if you can negotiate and get something good enough done, I think that's a hallmark of equity practice. Documenting our results, which we're all talking about. And I think fundamentally, at root, and I think I look to Norm for this, is the hope, the belief, the commitment that something can be changed for the better, that makes a difference, is the right thing to do. So these are the principles, and I'm not going to read this to you, don't worry, but I made myself write this paragraph to see if this RAD, rental assistance demonstration, sort of adhered to those principles, and I was persuaded by doing that, and I called Norm back and I said, okay, I'll write the chapter for you. So the sort of the design and the flow of the chapter is, the first part of it is talking about, well, there is great inequality in public housing compared to other forms of housing, compared to who lives there, compared to the benefits, compared to the capital, compared to the choices that people have. So getting that established and the need for overhauling that. Sean had already, the secretary had already determined that. A number of the people he recruited, it was like there was no question about this because of their previous experience. He came in ready to go, but try to establish, make the case for this, then try to overlay the equity sort of principles and design that I talked about. And then I take those, again, kind of literally, I go through how the secretary sees the initiative. He came into office around the crisis, the housing crisis. We were melting down as a country, largely because of the housing crisis. Sean shifted the agenda away from, oh my God, what are we going to do about Lehman Brothers, to we need more rental affordable housing in this country. He very deftly did that. So he sees that initiative and reframed, we need a balanced housing policy in this country, including doing a better job about public housing. So then talk a little bit about what HUD did to make the case that was obvious to the team that Sean brought together. The initial concept for driving this rental assistance demonstration was called something else. It was called Petra, and how he really focused on defining 3 kind of equity-oriented policy goals in this Petra, or rental assistance demonstration, ultimately. The first was, we've got to get more money into the public housing system, and there's a better, smarter way to do it that we know how to do it. We need to change the statute to make sure that we can do that. The second thing is that when we do that, we can do something about where public housing is sited, where it's located. It's often not in the best site. Sometimes in cities where Bob and I tend to live or spend our time in, it's in more desirable locations now. But oftentimes we don't see public housing sited in the best locations. So Sean said, hey, we ought to be able to transfer that assistance to somewhere else as part of the deal. If we're going to have a new system for funding and financing, let's have the ability to have residents actually live in better places, neighborhoods of opportunity. So one of the policy dimensions of this is to pick up, frankly, from your public housing and move it somewhere else. Make it less dense, make it more workable, fit it into the neighborhood patterns and context. The third policy objective that Sean sought was he was bound and determined that residents of public housing, for all that they've been through, ought to have an opportunity to get the heck out. They didn't like it. They didn't like what we were going to do with this new rental assistance demonstration after we proved the housing, moved it maybe to better locations. They ought to have the ability to say, I'd like to have another choice here. I'd like to be able to get up and go. And that's really what the rental assistance demonstration objectives are all about. So I kind of walk through how those principles and the practice and all the good things about building a narrative and building stakeholders, and some of that did better than others. And then there was a failure. There was a great failure in all this. There was some political tone deafness. There was some probably lack of attention to bringing along major constituencies, a lack of due attention to cultivating the Congress, and this initiative got nowhere in 2 years' time. So there had to be a recalibration, which I think is also a hallmark of equity planning and practice. You just don't have A and you go to B and you're done. It's persistence. It's sort of recalibrating. It's adjusting with sort of what you have to do on the ground and face the challenges. So then the rest of the chapter basically shows there was a writing of that. There was a rebranding, if you will. The Petra thing, which was called Preservation, Enhancement, Transformation, Housing Assistance. People started deridingly calling it People for the Ethical Treatment of Rental Assistance because it had gotten so far off whack. So we had to bring it back and say, hey, it's just a rental assistance demonstration, for crying out loud. We're going to do these 3 simple things, and let's get behind this. And so the rest of the chapter is really about trying to show how, again, equity practices and lessons were used to right that ship, if you will, get the legislation passed, follow that through into initial implementation, which we think has been so far so good. So that's kind of the arc of the story in the chapter, if you will. These are sort of self-confessional here. I noticed that nobody else has plopped down a fully completed draft paper on the table. I actually have one in my briefcase, but it's way too long, so I'm working on sort of honing that down. One of the things I am struggling with, and I hope we can talk about a little bit today, is, who's our audience? I kind of get mostly it's going to be graduate students and, everybody that knows Norm, and maybe Todd will get, some of his friends to buy the book. But who are we writing this for? And the level of, one of the things I'm having to struggle with is the technical sort of explanations. Okay, transferring subsidies from the Section 8 ACC Section 9 platform to the Section 8 Housing Assistance platform. I mean, that's kind of nutty stuff. So I'm working through trying to simplify all that. Anyway, Then there's, how much of this congressional, kind of back and forth is of real interest to anybody, but it was essential to the story. So I've got a few more things. I'm running it by colleagues. I'm going to sit and talk with Sean about all this. I'm going to try and, get some quotes and do some things. So that's what I'm still working on. That's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you.